The political and strategic environment of late 1972 presented a uniquely volatile matrix of diplomatic maneuvering and military escalation that culminated in one of the most concentrated and devastating aerial bombardments in the history of warfare. For over a decade, the United States had been deeply entangled in the Vietnam War, utilizing a wide array of tactical and strategic approaches to compel the government of North Vietnam to cease its support for the insurgency in the South and negotiate a lasting peace. By the autumn of 1972, following the massive conventional clash of the Easter Offensive and the subsequent American response known as Operation Linebacker I, it appeared that a breakthrough was finally at hand. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger had engaged in grueling, secret negotiations in Paris with North Vietnamese diplomat Le Duc Tho, reaching a tentative agreement in October that prompted Kissinger's famous declaration that peace was at hand. However, this fragile diplomatic construct rapidly unraveled. The president of South Vietnam, Nguyen Van Thu, adamantly refused to sign the agreement, realizing that the provisions allowing North Vietnamese troops to remain in place within South Vietnamese territory amounted to a delayed death sentence for his government. When the United States attempted to introduce Thu's modifications to the treaty, the North Vietnamese delegation, sensing American domestic fatigue and political weakness following the November presidential election, dug in their heels. By mid-December, Le Duc Tho essentially suspended the talks, presenting the Nixon administration with a catastrophic diplomatic stalemate. President Richard Nixon, having just secured a landslide re-election victory but facing a hostile Congress that was threatening to cut off all funding for the war when it reconvened in January, felt he had run out of time and diplomatic options. Nixon determined that a massive, unprecedented application of strategic air power was the only remaining lever to force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table and compel them to sign the accords, while simultaneously demonstrating to South Vietnam that the United States would enforce the peace. This decision birthed Operation Linebacker II, an 11-day campaign that would forever alter the legacy of the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress and the history of the Cold War. The weapon chosen for this campaign was the B-52 Stratofortress, a massive, 8-engine strategic bomber originally designed in the 1950s to carry nuclear weapons deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. By 1972, the B-52 had been extensively modified for conventional warfare, particularly the D&G models. The B-52D models, operating primarily from U Tapao Royal Thai Navy Airfield in Thailand, had undergone the Big Belly modification, allowing them to carry an astonishing conventional payload of up to 108 500-pound or 750-pound bombs, giving them a destructive footprint that could obliterate a target box a mile long and half a mile wide. The B-52G models, stationed at Andersen Air Force Base on the island of Guam, had longer range but lacked the Big Belly modification, carrying a smaller internal bomb load. Furthermore, many of the G models lacked the latest electronic countermeasure, ECM, upgrades, a technical deficiency that would prove tragically significant in the skies over Hanoi. The logistics of assembling and operating this massive armada were staggering. Andersen Air Force Base was transformed into the busiest airfield in the world, with bombers lined up wingtip to wingtip along the taxiways. The missions from Guam required flights of over 12 hours round trip, necessitating complex mid-air refueling operations over the Pacific Ocean utilizing fleets of KC-135 Stratotankers. The physical and psychological strain on the aircrews was immense. They were preparing to fly enormous, relatively slow, non-stealthy aircraft directly into what was universally acknowledged as the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. North Vietnam's capital, Hanoi, and its primary port city, Haiphong, were protected by a dense, fully integrated air defense system built upon Soviet technology and refined by years of combat experience against American tactical aircraft. The backbone of this system was the SA-2 Guidelines surface-to-air missile, a two-stage weapon capable of reaching altitudes of 60,000 feet at Mach 3. The SA-2 was guided by the Fan Song radar system, which tracked the incoming bombers and transmitted steering commands to the missile. Surrounding the SAM sites were hundreds of anti-aircraft artillery, AAA, batteries, ranging from rapid-fire 23mm cannons to massive 130mm guns that threw flak into the stratosphere. Complementing the ground-based defenses were squadrons of MiG-21 Fishbed interceptors, agile supersonic fighters guided by Ground Control Intercept (GCI) radars. The North Vietnamese air defense commanders had spent years studying American flight patterns, radar jamming frequencies, and tactical doctrines. They knew that the B-52s relied on mutual ECM support, flying in tight three-ship formations called cells, to create a blanket of electronic noise that degraded the fan song radars. To counter this, the North Vietnamese developed tactics to visually track the bombers using optical sights, or to fire missiles in ballistic barrages into the center of the jamming clouds, knowing that a detonation within a few hundred feet of a B-52 would spray the unarmored bomber with lethal shrapnel. The defenders of Hanoi were highly disciplined, fiercely motivated, and technologically prepared for the onslaught that began on the evening of December 18, 1972. The planning for the initial phases of Linebacker 2 was conducted at the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command, SAC, in Omaha, Nebraska, thousands of miles away from the realities of the Southeast Asian theater. Under the command of General J.C. Meyer, SAC planners approached the campaign with a rigid, institutional mindset geared toward nuclear war rather than conventional tactical bombing. They mandated standardized routing, altitudes, and speeds for the bomber streams, believing that strict adherence to the planned formations was necessary to maximize the effectiveness of the ECM cells. The bombers were ordered to fly in long, single-file streams, approaching Hanoi from the northwest, maintaining steady altitudes and airspeeds to ensure precise bomb delivery. Most catastrophically, SAC mandated that immediately after releasing their bombs, the B-52s were to execute a sharp, steep turn, a post-target turn, PTT, to exit the target area as quickly as possible. This maneuver had been designed to get the bombers away from the blast radius of a nuclear detonation, but in the conventional environment of Hanoi, it was a deadly mistake. The steep banking maneuver disrupted the overlapping electronic jamming signals of the three ship cells, momentarily exposing the bombers to the full glare of the fan song radars. Furthermore, because of the prevailing jet stream winds, turning back to the west pushed the bombers into a massive headwind, drastically reducing their ground speed and keeping them in the lethal engagement zone of the SAW-2 batteries for a longer period. When the first wave of 129 B-52s launched from Guam and Thailand on the night of December 18, the scale of the operation created an unmistakable radar signature that the North Vietnamese detected hours in advance. As the bombers crossed into North Vietnamese airspace, they were met by a ferocity of resistance that shocked the American crews. The night sky over Hanoi erupted into a chaotic, terrifying spectacle of blinding searchlights, tracer fire, and the brilliant, fast-moving exhaust plumes of dozens of SA-2 missiles. The North Vietnamese launched barrage after barrage of missiles into the bomber streams. The B-52 crews, strapped into their vibrating cockpits, watched in horror as the SAMs detonated around them, the explosions rocking the massive aircraft and filling the airwaves with frantic calls for evasive action. Despite the intense defenses, the bombers pressed on, devastating their assigned targets, including rail yards, vehicle repair facilities, and warehouses. However, the cost was immediate and severe. 3 B-52s were shot down on the first night, their crews forced to bail out over hostile territory to become prisoners of war or perish in the wreckage. 2 of these losses occurred precisely during the post-target turn, confirming the fatal flaw in the SAC routing. Despite these losses, SAC headquarters viewed the first night as a statistical success, an acceptable attrition rate for a campaign of such magnitude. The second night of the campaign, December 19, saw 93 B-52s attack similar targets. The North Vietnamese, having expended a massive number of missiles the previous night, were slightly more restrained, and the American forces suffered no bomber losses. This seemingly positive result induced a false sense of security at SAC headquarters, reinforcing their belief that their rigid, standardized tactics were effective. They ignored the urgent pleas from the tactical commanders in Guam and Thailand, who were demanding the authority to alter routes, altitudes, and evasive maneuvers to introduce unpredictability into the attacks. The crews themselves were becoming increasingly anxious, realizing that they were flying predictable paths into a highly adaptive and lethal defense system. This anxiety transformed into outright crisis on the third night of the campaign, December 20th, a night that would become the darkest chapter in the history of the B-52. On the night of December 20th, SAC dispatched 99 bombers against Hanoi and Haiphong, utilizing the exact same routes, altitudes, and post-target turns as the previous 2 nights. The North Vietnamese air defense commanders had completely deciphered the American playbook. They knew exactly where the bombers were coming from, how they were flying, and precisely where they would execute their vulnerable turns. The North Vietnamese husbanded their SAMs, waiting for the perfect moments to strike. As the B-52s entered the target area, the defenders unleashed a coordinated, overwhelming barrage. The sky was filled with flying telephone poles, the colloquial term used by the crews for the SA-2S. The radar warning receivers in the bombers shrieked continuously, indicating lock-ons from multiple tracking radars. The defensive countermeasures were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of missiles and the predictive accuracy of the North Vietnamese fire. In a span of just a few hours, the American Armada suffered catastrophic losses. 6 B-52s were shot out of the sky, including 3 of the vulnerable G models from Guam. The loss of 6 strategic bombers in a single night sent shockwaves through the military establishment. At Andersen Air Force Base, the mood among the returning crews was toxic, bordering on mutinous. The airmen were furious with the generals in Omaha, accusing them of sending crews to their deaths through tactical incompetence and rigid adherence to nuclear-era doctrines that had no place over a modern, heavily defended conventional battlefield. The disaster of December 20th forced an immediate and drastic re-evaluation of the campaign. General Meyer and the SAC leadership, facing the prospect of losing the core of the United States strategic deterrent, realized that they could no longer run the tactical execution of the war from halfway across the globe. Authority was finally delegated to the commanders of the 8th Air Force in Guam, who possessed the recent combat experience and understanding necessary to adapt to the North Vietnamese defenses. The changes implemented for the fourth night, December 21st, were significant. The vulnerable B-52G models, lacking the full ECM suites, were restricted to striking less heavily defended targets around Haiphong and away from the dense SAM rings of Hanoi. The routing was varied, bringing the bombers in from different directions and at different altitudes to confuse the tracking radars. The deadly post-target turn was heavily modified or eliminated, with bombers ordered to fly straight out over the Gulf of Tonkin after releasing their bombs, keeping the wind at their backs and their ECM cells intact. Furthermore, the role of tactical support aircraft was greatly expanded. Fleets of F-4 Phantom fighters deployed massive corridors of radar reflecting chaff ahead of the bomber streams, blinding the Fan Song radars. F-105 Wild Weasels and F-4 Hunter killer teams aggressively patrolled the airspace, launching anti-radiation missiles against any SAM radar that dared to transmit. F-111 Aardvark swing-wing bombers, operating at treetop level under the cover of darkness, conducted precision strikes against SAM sites and MiG airfields just moments before the B-52s arrived overhead. These tactical innovations immediately altered the balance of power. Over the next 3 nights, from December 22nd to December 24th, the B-52s continued their relentless pounding of North Vietnamese infrastructure, striking petroleum storage facilities, railway marshalling yards, and communication centers. The varied routing and the massive application of tactical support suppressed the effectiveness of the SA-2 network. Losses dropped significantly, though the danger remained ever present, and a few more bombers fell to the persistent defenders. The sheer tonnage of high explosives raining down on the North Vietnamese logistics network was beginning to paralyze the country. Entire industrial sectors were being flattened, rail lines were severed, and the stockpiles of surface-to-air missiles, rapidly expended during the first few nights, were running critically low without the ability to easily resupply from the Soviet Union due to the mining of Haiphong Harbor earlier in the year. Despite the military success of the revised tactics, the global political reaction to the bombing was intensely negative. Images of destruction, inevitably including civilian casualties despite the strict military targeting criteria, fueled international condemnation and domestic anti-war protests. The North Vietnamese government utilized the destruction of areas like the Com Thien Street, which was tragically hit by a string of bombs from a B-52 that had been damaged by a SAM and thrown off course, as powerful propaganda to portray the campaign as an indiscriminate terror bombing. On Christmas Day, President Nixon ordered a 36-hour halt to the bombing. This pause was ostensibly a humanitarian gesture for the holiday, but strategically, it served as a final ultimatum to Hanoi. Nixon transmitted a message through diplomatic channels stating that the bombing would resume with even greater ferocity if North Vietnam did not agree to return to the Paris peace talks within 72 hours. The North Vietnamese leadership, reeling from the destruction but still defiant, calculated that the United States could not sustain the domestic and international political pressure, nor the loss of its strategic bombers, for much longer. They believed that if they could weather a few more days of bombing, Nixon would be forced to capitulate. They utilized the Christmas pause to frantically redistribute their remaining SAM stocks, repair damaged radar sites, and prepare for the resumption of hostilities, hoping to inflict unacceptable losses on the Americans in the next phase of the battle. When the North Vietnamese failed to respond to the ultimatum, the American military unleashed the climax of Operation Linebacker II on the night of December 26. This operation, planned and executed by the tactical commanders of the 8th Air Force, was a masterpiece of aerial warfare coordination. Instead of the long, predictable streams of the first 3 nights, the December 26 attack was a simultaneous, overwhelming saturation of the entire North Vietnamese air defense system. 120 B-52s, converging from bases in Thailand and Guam, hit Hanoi and Haiphong at exactly the same time from 7 different directions. The strike was orchestrated to compress the entire bombing run into a mere 15-minute window. This massive armada was supported by over 100 tactical aircraft laying chaff, suppressing radars, and flying combat air patrols. When the bombers entered the airspace, the North Vietnamese defenders were completely overwhelmed. Their radar scopes were flooded with hundreds of targets, ghost signals from the chaff, and blinding electronic noise from the massed ECM suites. The SAM operators, unable to distinguish the real bombers from the electronic clutter, fired their remaining missiles in desperate, unguided barrages. The sheer density of the attack meant that the defenses simply could not engage enough targets simultaneously. While 2 B-52s were lost during this massive raid, the attack broke the back of the North Vietnamese air defense system. The major targets, including the vital Thanh Nguyen steel plant and the Giop Nhi rail yards, were obliterated. Over the next 3 nights, from December 27 to December 29, the character of the campaign changed completely. The North Vietnamese had virtually exhausted their supply of SA-2 missiles. The once terrifying skies over Hanoi grew relatively quiet, with only sporadic and ineffective AAA fire greeting the bombers. The B-52s roamed the airspace with near impunity, systematically destroying the remaining logistical and industrial targets on the strategic list. The realization set in among the North Vietnamese leadership that they were completely defenseless against the total destruction of their capital and their war-making infrastructure. The strategy of waiting out the American political will had failed in the face of the relentless, devastating physical destruction of their country. On December 29, recognizing that their military capability was being dismantled brick by brick, the North Vietnamese government transmitted a message to Washington, agreeing to resume the peace negotiations in Paris without preconditions. President Nixon immediately ordered a halt to all bombing north of the 20th parallel, effectively ending Operation Linebacker II. The physical toll of the 11-day campaign was staggering. The United States Air Force had flown over 700 B-52 sorties, dropping over 15,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam. The destruction of military and industrial infrastructure was immense, severing the logistical arteries that supplied the insurgency in South Vietnam. However, the cost in American lives and prestige was also significant. 15 B-52 Stratofortresses had been destroyed, with several others heavily damaged. 33 crew members were killed or missing in action, and another 33 became prisoners of war, joining the hundreds of American aviators already held in the infamous Hoa Lo prison, known ironically as the Hanoi Hilton. The loss of the B-52s, the symbols of American strategic might, demonstrated the extreme vulnerability of large, conventional bombers in a modern, dense surface-to-air missile environment. On the North Vietnamese side, the government claimed that over 1,600 civilians had been killed during the campaign. While this number was tragically high, military analysts later argued that given the sheer tonnage of bombs dropped on heavily populated urban areas, the relatively low civilian death toll demonstrated the accuracy of the B-52 radar bombing systems and the strict adherence to military targeting, contrasting sharply with the indiscriminate city-busting raids of the Second World War. The diplomatic aftermath of Linebacker II was immediate and decisive. In January 1973, Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho returned to Paris, and within weeks, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement allowed for the complete withdrawal of American military forces from South Vietnam and the return of all American prisoners of war, fulfilling President Nixon's primary political objectives. Operation Linebacker II achieved exactly what it was designed to do, it broke the diplomatic deadlock through the application of overwhelming, punitive military force. However, the long-term strategic reality was far more ambiguous. While the bombing compelled North Vietnam to sign the treaty, it did not alter the fundamental balance of power on the ground in Southeast Asia. The North Vietnamese army remained intact within the borders of South Vietnam, positioning them for the final, successful offensive 2 years later in 1975, when the United States, paralyzed by the Watergate scandal and congressional prohibitions against further military action, failed to intervene. Therefore, the legacy of Linebacker II is intensely debated. It was a resounding tactical and operational success that achieved a specific, short-term diplomatic goal, but it failed to secure the long-term survival of the South Vietnamese state. Beyond its immediate political impact, Operation Linebacker II triggered a profound technological and doctrinal revolution within the United States military, fundamentally shaping the future of aerial warfare. The heavy losses suffered by the B-52 fleet during the early days of the campaign highlighted the obsolescence of unstealthy, high-altitude penetration against modern, integrated air defense systems. The Air Force realized that the era of massive bomber formations plowing through radar coverage relying solely on electronic jamming was over. This realization accelerated the development of two critical technological pathways. First, it validated the absolute necessity of suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD, as a prerequisite for any major air campaign. The success of the Wild Weasels and the F-111s in the later stages of Linebacker II proved that specialized aircraft dedicated to hunting and destroying radar sites were essential. Second, and more importantly, the vulnerability of the B-52 birthed the pursuit of stealth technology. The realization that an aircraft needed to be invisible to radar to survive over the modern battlefield led directly to the development of the F-117 Nighthawk and the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. Furthermore, the reliance on unguided gravity bombs, which required the aircraft to fly directly over the target, spurred the rapid development and deployment of precision-guided munitions, PGMs, such as laser-guided bombs and cruise missiles, allowing aircraft to destroy targets from standoff ranges outside the lethal engagement zones of surface-to-air missiles. The institutional shock of the campaign also led to a revolution in aircrew training. The Air Force recognized that the rigid, inflexible tactics dictated by SAC headquarters during the initial nights of the campaign had directly contributed to the heavy losses. The need for dynamic, realistic training that allowed crews to practice against simulated Soviet-style air defense networks led to the creation of the Red Flag exercise program at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Red Flag transformed tactical aviation, ensuring that future generations of American aviators would not experience their first combat against an integrated air defense system in the skies over a hostile capital, but rather in the controlled, rigorous environment of a training range. The lessons learned in the bloody skies over Hanoi in 1972 were directly applied to the planning and execution of Operation Desert Storm nearly 2 decades later, where a coalition air force, utilizing stealth technology, precision weapons, and aggressive SEAD tactics, dismantled the Iraqi air defense system with surgical efficiency and minimal losses. The narrative of Operation Linebacker II is fundamentally a story of human endurance, mechanical terror, and the brutal calculus of strategic coercion. For the men who flew the B-52s, it was an experience of unimaginable stress, flying straight and level into a sky filled with lethal explosions, trusting in the skill of their electronic warfare officers and the structural integrity of their massive aircraft. The courage of these crews, who climbed back into their bombers night after night despite witnessing the fiery destruction of their comrades, remains a testament to the discipline and professionalism of the strategic bomber force. For the North Vietnamese defenders on the ground, it was a battle of desperate resilience, operating their radar consoles and missile launchers while the earth shook beneath them, enduring the heaviest aerial bombardment since the end of the Second World War. Their ability to adapt their tactics, husband their resources, and inflict severe losses on the most powerful air force in the world demonstrated a level of military competence that commanded the respect of their adversaries. In the final analysis, Operation Linebacker II stands as the defining moment of the air war in Vietnam and the absolute apex of the Cold War strategic bomber doctrine. It was the last time in history that massive fleets of heavy bombers would be used in a concentrated, sustained campaign against a heavily defended, industrialized capital city. The visual imagery of the campaign, the dark, sweeping silhouettes of the stratofortresses, the blinding flashes of the SAW-2 detonations, the contrails weaving through the stratosphere, remains etched into the historical consciousness of the 20th century. It was an 11-day war that tested the limits of technology, the boundaries of human courage, and the effectiveness of military force as an instrument of political persuasion. The B-52s went to Hanoi to force a conclusion to a conflict that had fractured a generation, and while they succeeded in bringing the combatants to the negotiating table, the echoes of those thunderous nights over the Red River Delta continue to resonate in the strategic doctrines and geopolitical realities of the modern world. The intricate coordination required to launch and recover the bomber streams from multiple bases across the Pacific theater was a logistical triumph that was rarely fully appreciated. The operations at U-Tapao in Thailand were particularly intense, as the base was located much closer to the target area, allowing the B-52D models to launch, strike their targets, return, reload, and launch again within the same 24-hour cycle. The ground crews, armorers, and maintenance personnel worked in exhausting, around-the-clock shifts to keep the aircraft serviceable. The sheer volume of ordnance being moved, the millions of gallons of jet fuel being pumped, and the complex choreography of taxiing dozens of giant aircraft on crowded aprons required a level of organizational precision that pushed the Air Force's logistical capabilities to their absolute limits. At Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, the logistics of the aerial refueling tracks added another layer of complexity. The KC-135 Stratotankers had to rendezvous with the bomber streams at precise coordinates and times over the vast expanse of the Pacific, transferring thousands of pounds of fuel to enable the B-52G models to complete their grueling missions. A failure at any point in this logistical chain, a missed refueling rendezvous, a delayed bomb loading, a mechanical breakdown on the taxiway, could disrupt the timing of the entire strike package, exposing the bombers to greater risk over the target. The electronic warfare battle waged in the invisible spectrum above Hanoi was as fierce and complex as the physical battle of missiles and bombs. The B-52s were equipped with suites of electronic countermeasures, including the ALQ-117 and ALQ-122 jamming systems, designed to blind the fan-song tracking radars and spoof the proximity fuses of the SAW-2 missiles. The electronic warfare officers, EWAS, aboard the bombers were engaged in a continuous, high-stakes duel with the North Vietnamese radar operators. As the radar frequencies shifted and changed, the EWAS had to rapidly analyze the signals, tune their jammers, and coordinate their electronic emissions with the other aircraft in their cell. The North Vietnamese, recognizing the reliance on these jamming cells, developed tactics to disrupt them. They used barrage firing, launching multiple missiles unguided into the center of the jamming noise, hoping for a lucky hit or forcing the bombers to take evasive action that would break the cell formation. They also relied heavily on their spoon rest early warning radars, which operated on lower frequencies less affected by the B-52's jammers, to track the bomber streams and vector MiG interceptors into position. The MiGs, often operating without radar to remain undetected, would fly alongside the bomber streams, transmitting altitude and heading information to the SAM batteries on the ground, allowing for visually guided or optically tracked missile launches that completely bypassed the American electronic countermeasures. The experience inside the cockpit of a B-52 during a SAM engagement was a sensory overload of noise, vibration, and sheer terror. The aircraft commander and the pilot concentrated on flying the massive aircraft, maintaining the rigid parameters required for the bombing run while battling the violent turbulence caused by the exploding missiles. The radar navigator and the navigator in the lower deck hunched over their radar scopes, desperately trying to identify the target aim points through the electronic clutter and the smoke of the burning city. The EWO, sitting in the upper deck facing backward, monitored the threat displays, calling out the launch of SAMs and deploying chaff and flares. The tail gunner, isolated in the rear of the aircraft, scanning the darkness for the exhaust plumes of MiGs, felt the concussive force of every nearby detonation with terrifying intensity. When a missile scored a direct hit, the results were catastrophic. The shrapnel from the massive warhead would tear through the thin aluminum skin of the bomber, severing hydraulic lines, igniting fuel tanks, and devastating the crew compartments. If the aircraft lost structural integrity, the crew had only seconds to initiate the bailout sequence, ejecting into the freezing air at 30,000 feet and descending into the heavily armed, intensely hostile territory of North Vietnam. The fate of the crewmen who successfully bailed out and were captured became a central focus of the campaign's aftermath. The sudden influx of dozens of B-52 crew members into the Wallow prison added a new dynamic to the POW population. These men, fresh from the strategic bomber bases, brought news of the massive escalation of the war and the intense political pressure being applied to Hanoi. The North Vietnamese interrogators, furious at the destruction of their capital, subjected the newly captured aviators to brutal treatment, attempting to extract propaganda statements condemning the bombing. The resilience of these men, enduring physical and psychological torture while maintaining the military chain of command within the prison walls, became a defining element of the American POW experience in Vietnam. Their eventual release during Operation Homecoming in the spring of 1973 was the emotional culmination of the entire Southeast Asian conflict, providing the American public with a tangible, though bittersweet, sense of closure. The political calculations within the White House during the 11 days of Linebacker II were fraught with tension and controversy. President Nixon, isolated and brooding in the Executive Office building, monitored the daily reports of bomber losses with growing anxiety. He was deeply concerned about the reaction of the American public and the international community, but he remained steadfast in his conviction that the bombing was the only way to achieve a viable peace agreement. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and his deputy, Alexander Haig, constantly analyzed the diplomatic backchannels, looking for any sign that the North Vietnamese resolve was breaking. They faced intense pressure from Congress, where anti-war sentiment was reaching a fever pitch, with threats of legislative action that would permanently cut off all funding for the military operations in Southeast Asia. Nixon knew he was racing against a ticking political clock. If the bombing did not force Hanoi back to the table before Congress reconvened in early January, the United States might be forced to abandon South Vietnam unconditionally. The success of the campaign on December 29, when Hanoi finally agreed to resume talks, was viewed by the administration as a narrow, desperately needed vindication of their high-risk strategy, though the political damage to Nixon's presidency, already weakened by the emerging Watergate scandal, was irreversible. The historical debates surrounding Operation Linebacker II continue to shape military and political discourse. Critics of the campaign argue that the bombing was an unnecessary application of brute force that achieved little more than the destruction of North Vietnamese infrastructure and the loss of innocent civilian lives, asserting that the terms of the Paris Peace Accords signed in January 1973 were virtually identical to the agreement that had been negotiated in October 1972 before the bombing began. From this perspective, Linebacker II was a tragic, bloody coda to a failed war, designed primarily to reassure the South Vietnamese government rather than to force concessions from the North. Proponents of the campaign, however, argue that the bombing was absolutely essential. They contend that the North Vietnamese had no intention of signing the October agreement and were stalling for time, waiting for the American Congress to defund the war. They point out that the sheer physical destruction of the North Vietnamese logistical network and the exhaustion of their air defense missiles rendered them militarily incapable of launching another major offensive in the immediate future, thereby providing the South Vietnamese government with a crucial, albeit temporary, window of survival. Regardless of these competing interpretations, the factual reality remains that Operation Linebacker II was the catalyst that ended direct American military involvement in the Vietnam War. The legacy of the campaign also extends to the evolution of international law and the laws of armed conflict. The massive aerial bombardment of a populated urban area, even with the technological limitations of the era and the strict adherence to military targeting, raised profound ethical and legal questions regarding proportionality and the protection of civilians in warfare. The images of the devastation in Hanoi fueled international movements demanding stricter regulations on the use of air power and the classification of legitimate military targets. While the United States vehemently denied accusations of indiscriminate terror bombing, citing the efforts to avoid civilian areas and the precision of the radar bombing systems, the controversy surrounding the civilian death toll during Linebacker II influenced subsequent international agreements and shaped the rules of engagement for future American military operations, emphasizing the critical importance of minimizing collateral damage through the use of precision-guided munitions and rigorous target vetting processes. In examining the tactical evolution of the campaign, the shift from the rigid, centralized planning of the first 3 nights to the decentralized, dynamic execution of the later phases provides a classic case study in military adaptation. General J.C. Meyer's initial reluctance to deviate from the established SAC doctrines reflected an institutional hubris that underestimated the adaptability and lethality of the enemy. The realization that the North Vietnamese had deciphered the tactical patterns and were exploiting the vulnerabilities of the B-52 routing forced a painful but necessary surrender of control to the operational commanders on the ground. When the 8th Air Force commanders were given the authority to dictate tactics, they immediately implemented the varied routing, the aggressive seed support, and the simultaneous saturation attacks that ultimately broke the North Vietnamese air defense system. This transition demonstrated that flexibility, unpredictability, and the empowerment of local commanders are essential principles of warfare, particularly when confronting a determined, technologically capable adversary. The success of the December 26 maximum effort strike, orchestrating the arrival of 120 bombers over the target area within a 15-minute window, remains one of the greatest feats of aerial coordination in military history, proving that overwhelming mass, when applied with tactical ingenuity, can neutralize even the most formidable defensive networks. The narrative of Operation Linebacker II cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the profound impact it had on the people of North Vietnam. For 11 days and nights, the residents of Hanoi and Haiphong lived in a state of constant terror, enduring the apocalyptic roar of the B-52s, the earth-shattering explosions of the bombs, and the rain of shrapnel from the defending missiles. The evacuation of civilians to the countryside, the frantic construction of air raid shelters, and the daily struggle for survival amidst the destruction of essential services demonstrated a remarkable resilience and societal cohesion. The North Vietnamese government utilized the bombing to galvanize the population, portraying the endurance of the capital as a symbol of national defiance and the ultimate victory of the revolutionary spirit over American technological might. The physical scars of the bombing, the craters in the landscape, and the monuments to the fallen remain visible reminders of the campaign in modern Vietnam, serving as powerful symbols of the country's turbulent history and its capacity to endure and rebuild from the ashes of conflict. Ultimately, the B-52s going to Hanoi in 1972 represented the violent intersection of strategic desperation, technological warfare, and political maneuvering. It was a campaign characterized by immense destruction, heartbreaking losses, and unparalleled aerial coordination. It marked the end of an era in strategic bombing and laid the conceptual foundation for the modern aerospace operations of the 21st century. The echoes of Operation Linebacker II, the roar of the 8 engines, the shriek of the radar warning receivers, the blinding flashes in the night sky, continue to reverberate through the annals of military history, serving as a stark, enduring testament to the catastrophic power of the machines we build and the devastating consequences of the wars we choose to fight. The 11-day campaign stands as a monolithic monument to the complexities of the Vietnam conflict, a moment when the ultimate weapon of the Cold War was unleashed in a desperate bid to secure an elusive, fleeting peace.